Welcome to The Logic of Faith, installation 3. So last time we looked a little bit at the problem around knowing, the rigidity with which we can approach things, and the value of the open inquiry, or the value of basically open-mindedness. We're going to pursue this here. We're going to be aligning ourselves a little bit more with Buddhist methodologies. It's getting a bit more systematic, but it's really important to start off with this appreciation that we could actually know things without necessarily it having to be something dogmatic or us being fundamentalist around our knowledge. It's not just purely in terms of the rule as such, but it's also the emotion that goes into it. Now, when we're saying approach to finding certainty beyond belief and doubt, see, we could actually, and what we're going to be looking at here is really navigating free of these two extremes, belief, doubt, and so forth. You have the famous example in Buddhism about delusion, with the example of mistaking a rope that we see on the path at dusk for being a snake. Now, when we look and we see that there is no snake, it's not as if we all of a sudden become ropists, that we all of a sudden become believers in the rope. Yeah, we can see the rope, and the main thing is really that we're no longer deluded in seeing the snake, and that's the relief. Yes, we see a rope, but that's not really it. It's more that we're freed from this notion that there was a snake, and that's where somebody says, "Is there a snake there?" You can say, "No, there's not," and then you say, "Sure," and say, "Yep, there's no snake." See, that's certainty, but it doesn't really mean that you've engaged in terms of a new dogma that believes or sort of endorses or refutes the rope. It's more that you looked, and there you shedded a delusional condition. So I think that's one way that we can understand this notion of what we could call certainty, which we call certainty in the view, but it's more about cleansing or purifying some assumptions that are not valid. It doesn't mean that we're replacing them with new dogmatic positions. Yeah? Let's hope that's what we're going to be doing. All right. So I'm always concerned that all the various, things are working, the recording, this audio, video, and so on. I think we're good. So we'll start with homage, the ode to grace. I pledge allegiance to the experience of grace, the expression of human insight from which all authentic faith traditions have arisen. I pledge allegiance to Mother Emptiness, Prajnaparamita, to the wisdom of the Buddha, and the great spiritual genius Nagarjuna. First and foremost, I pledge allegiance to my beloved teacher, Dziga Kongtrul Rinpoche. So now we're in chapter 2, and we're going to be looking at the mind. Now, in doing so, we're going to be going through some analysis, which, as Elizabeth points out, is about loosening the mind. It's about seeing and also getting free of this our belief system that veils our reality. And then we're going to be looking at something called the two truths, which emptiness and the two truths, which again is really just a way of validating the way that this integrates within our understanding. So poising the mind for insight. So Aryadeva, who by the way was the main sort of successor, if you like, of Nagarjuna, following Nagarjuna, he famously said, "The moment you begin to question that things may not be as they seem, the whole structure of your delusion begins to fall apart." And I don't know if it's Ayadeva himself or Tsongkhapa Rinpoche who's extrapolating from that, but he, in this conjunction, Tsongkhapa Rinpoche mentions with this quote that it's a bit like if we begin to question, it's a bit like dipping a cloth into acid. And you take it out of the acid again, and the cloth is still there, but all you need to do is blow, and it'll come undone. And similarly, with this inquiry that we're beginning to engage, we are going to be, the cloth is still going to be there, reality is still going to be there, but it's not going to be quite have the same hold on us. So what we're talking about, and this is implicit in what we call vipassana, is that we're just going to look straight at what things are. Like we're looking at this snake, right? And that's what's going to remedy it. It's not like I'm going to look away and I'm going to pretend the snake is not there. It's through looking that we're going to resolve this. So, of course, the process, yes, it's going to take us out of some habitual patterns. And we might just be feeling slightly sort of addicted to the sort of the fuzzy warm sense of the familiar. Sticking to the familiar feels, makes us feel that we're in a place that we know. It's familiar. Elizabeth, about this, she says, most of us are not habituated to staying open. We don't understand the nature of our thoughts and emotions. It takes some investigative wisdom to turn the tides of reactive mind. So we might say, well, things are the way they are. What do you mean they would be different? So that's where the introduction here of what we could call a vision beyond just the appearances is possibly provocative, if not irritating as such. But what we're going to see also is once we, and that's also where she quotes Dzogchen Ponlop Rinpoche, if we begin to analyze, that's where we begin to penetrate things, and also we're going to see the truth of the actual nature of reality. It doesn't mean that reality goes away. So in some way, the process here is going to take us into this understanding of shunyata and the two truths. Now, in doing this, we are going to find some resistance. Yeah, we're not used to looking directly at our mind, and this is interesting actually, that we're sometimes not aware really of what's happening in our mind. And if we then begin to meditate, we think that, oh, then something new is going to happen. And in fact, it's the same stuff that's there, but we're just looking at it differently. Elizabeth says the investigative path associated with the insight of Praticca Samutpada, traditionally referred to in Sanskrit as Madhyamaka, or the middle way, provides a way of exploring experience without getting overwhelmed by appearances. So again, this is where we're intending to see what we talked about last time, which is that things lean. They don't exist as we solidly think of them, and that's where this Praticca Samutpada, it is this insight into phenomena leaning. They don't go away as such, but we just begin to see that they don't have the reality that they have. And that is what we mean with the Madhyamaka, that things don't exist one way or the other. They lean. They are dependently arisen. They're conditional. So when we're doing this, then we are beginning to train a new muscle, which is the muscle of insight, or prajna. To do this, we need the ideal frame set of a scientist, which is curiosity, openness. And that is where openness is associated sometimes with the quality of not bringing our stuff to something, but actually looking beyond us. So we very often we talk about science having this objectivist angle in a very favorable way, that we're trying to go beyond the filter that the subject, the observer, brings to it. But the thing is, at this time, what we're observing, what is the object of our inquiry, is actually that the one that's doing the inquiry. It's the subject. Yeah? So on this adventure, we need curiosity and openness. We observe in the spirit of true science. You're going to have to get used to me correcting this as we go along. You never know. Who knows if I'll do this course again, in which case then we could yes, good for the next class. So, in the spirit of true science. The object of our inquiry, however, is the observing subject. We're bringing to this what we should actually do when we do proper science is that we are not, well, of course, we might start off with a hypothesis, but here it's not so much that we actually want to have an already existing idea, but we do have a method, we do have a way that we're going to be observing, which is looking. That's the method. The approach is one of fully experiencing. That means that we're actually completely engaging, and we're feeling. This science embraces the notion of experience. We observe who we are, emotions, perceptions, thoughts. So that is what we are. That is the subject of our inquiry. So when we think of perceptions as I look at a wall, I look at a lamp, and so forth, the way that I'm seeing these so-called outer realities, there is very strongly linked up with my inner attitude, my inner perception, and so forth. So the way that I'm engaging, that comes through this. It's not just that I have an objective existing lamp out there. I have right now my version of a lamp. So that experience is what we're looking at, and that's what we want to try to understand. That's where we begin to understand consciousness in terms of how it generates experience. So Elizabeth then defines experience as, quote, that which comes before your awareness, or in this case, that which you bring into focus as the object of your investigation. As we apply the methods in the following chapter, we will deliberately bring the mind to bear on certain objects of experience, which might be material, such as something, a person or an inanimate object, or might be a moment of consciousness, such as an emotion, a sensory perception, or a thought. Whatever comes before your awareness, you can examine. Now, the general sort of third-person objectivist approach is that we really only know something when we see it as something that is detached from the first-person experience. And so very often, the way that we understand the phenomenology or the psychological conditions is through this objectivist approach that understands things either in terms of what can be understood by observing, like behavior, or in terms of understanding, finding a common parameters for a large group, like say quantitative research, where we begin to extrapolate then conclusions about structures and the nature of the testimonials and so forth. So basically then what we call a third person observation, not the first person. And that's where we have an interesting approach or an interesting difference between the Buddhist notion of empiricism and the Buddhist science of consciousness, and that we have in, let's say, behaviorist psychology or cognitive psychology, which operates with this third person perspective. From the Buddhist point of view, what the individual experiences is equally empirical, equally reliable, verifiable. in terms of it's not caught up with belief systems or hocus pocus, metaphysics and so forth. It's something real. And as much as that has been somewhat criticized and, dismissed in the early stages of the 20th century and the developments within Western psychology, it is something that's been approached again through, and Elizabeth mentions Francisco Varela, a Chilean biologist and neuroscientist, who was one of the co-founders of Mind Life Institute. And he wrote in the, I forget when, but anyway, he wrote a famous paper that's called A Science of Consciousness, as if experience mattered. Now, Francisco, he studied, he was a recognized biologist, scientist, and so forth, but he went and studied with people like Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche. I actually met him at Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche's cremation in 1996. Drawing from the experience of then, or the science of Buddhism, then Francisco Varela wrote this paper and also other things. And we have nowadays also someone who sort of has been upholding Francisco's legacy. Well, many people have, and also obviously the Mind Life Institute is a reflection of what he's brought to neuroscience and the dialogue between Buddhism and neuroscience. But in this paper, and also we have a French neuroscientist and philosopher of science called Michel Bitbol, who's also who then has continued Francisco's work. He's written a paper that's called A Science of Consciousness as if Situation Matters, all drawing on the primacy of either the subject as a valid point of departure for understanding consciousness, and then Bitbol more the thing that we're discussing in this work, which is dependent arising and the lack of inherent existence. Anyway, just to take just a little place from Francisco's paper, he says, we need to turn to a systematic exploration of the only link between mind and consciousness that seems both obvious and natural, namely the structure of human experience itself. Practically speaking, this means taking the tradition of phenomenology as a science of experience seriously and linking it skillfully with modern science. So phenomenology exists as a way of understanding things free of a priori or preconceived ideas, metaphysics and beliefs and so on. And hence also this is a way that we explain human experience, but it's not very often linked up necessarily with science. This is obviously changing, but this is definitely key in the Buddhist approach, and this is also something that has then been taken up by Western scientists. So in, again, approaching this, now when we're going to be doing the investigation, we're going to be using the body. We're settling. We are going to be looking at the body through moving awareness through the body. We're not particularly trying to hold any particular state of mind. We don't need to block thoughts or be particularly tensed about sustaining some focus. We just want to notice sensations. And we are using awareness to simply begin to be with our body. In fact, in Buddhism, then the whole somatic approach is enormous. People very often think, oh, Buddhism, meditation is all sort of mental then, but it's not. It's very much linked up with the body. Elizabeth says, the reason for investigating any experience in the way we have just done is to see that things do not exist as they appear. To look directly at the body, for instance, moves us out of vague assumptions into a direct relationship with the nature of Praticca Samutpada. When we see beyond our coarse interpretations, we discover the less tangible and magical situations with which we live. So as we go through the body and we begin to have a more direct relationship with what we, for example, experience in terms of things that we very often just vaguely, so let's say we say the arm, but we begin to look and feel the arm and go through it, we begin to understand it's have a more clear relationship with it by the mere fact of just looking and not just existing as a label. And this is the wonderful thing about Paticca Samuppada, that we're going to see clearer. We're going beyond some preconceived ideas. We're going to see more by dissolving these ideas. She says what is it? The magical situation in which you live. And magical, this refers to the discovering the relativity of things. For example, we say here, but here, that's different, if somebody says, come over here, we don't know what they mean, Is it like here in the room? Is it here right next to me? Is it here over across, the and so forth? Here is a very valid word, definitely. See, I'm touching myself here. But unless you see this, there's no absolute here. It's not like it's sort of a Google pinpoint. And even a Google pinpoint, it also has an up and a down, a left and a right, yeah? Elizabeth says, the point of investigation is not to simply reach a conclusive truth, which would become yet another refined concept. Now, this is important, and this is really, again, coming back to the famous old rope. We're not about saying something about rope. We actually don't care. But what we do care about is the suffering that comes from believing that there is a snake. So we're not going to go into a whole song and dance about rope, or we're not going to go into a new dogma, but we just want to be free of some delusional assumptions. Hence, she continues, rather, the aim is to release your entire being from the misunderstanding that you are separate from the nature of mutual causality. So the way that we exist and the way that we identify things exists within a mutual causality, meaning they're dependent. We have labels, but they're really just based on, like, for example, and Elizabeth, when she was lecturing here in Sydney, and I think elsewhere, she brings along a stick, right? A little short stick, and then she says, is this long or short, and then, she takes along 2 sticks, and then she'll have one that's this big, and one that's this big, and she says, which is the short, which is the long? So obviously, like we saw last time. Now, the short and long is something that then is entirely mutually causal. The long stick is yes, it exists as long due to the little one. But then once there's an even longer stick, a branch, then the longer stick becomes the short stick. So this is how unfortunately, we get stuck in these assumptions around reality. Bottom line, we become happier, nicer, less aggressive, because we're well, as we're saying here, we're loosening our rigidity, and that's what's implicit in this notion of analysis. She quotes Shantideva, the intention of logical investigation is not to refute sight, sound, or knowing. Our aim is to reverse the cause of suffering, clinging to things as real. So we're clear on what we're doing. This is not about a new set of ideas. It's about freeing ourselves. Now, analytical meditation might for some then sound as if it's cold and clinical. She says, don't be put off by the clinical sound of analytical meditation. But what we do with analysis, and she draws on the etymology of the word analysis, which in the Greek means to loosen. So it is to break up rigidity and loosen up assumptions. Attentive analysis brings up insight, opens new doors. It is to make a personal experience of important ideas. So with analysis, we begin to see the nature of things. We begin to see through some assumptions. And that's the loosening part. And in that we're doing that, we're beginning to actually have some insights that enables confidence in our own intelligence. We begin to have this power of prajna that sees through deception. And that gives some joy in engaging with phenomena in a greater way. We are not so easily confused or overwhelmed. So, that's what we're proposing here, that samsara is eliminated by seeing through delusion. We're seeing through these mistaken assumptions. This intelligence that sees is prajna. Pra is greater degree, and jna is knowing. So one way for us to achieve this is to analyze. We would say there's two kinds. One is the vipassana of analysis. There's also the vipassana of settling, which we do in meditation, where we settle the mind in this capacity where we don't get caught up in delusion. Elizabeth says, in Buddhist texts, you find a Sanskrit term that describes the aspect of mind you depend on to intelligently engage experience, namely prajna. You could say that prajna accurately perceives things without impediment. For this reason, it is used in the Buddhist teaching to mean insight into the nature of how things truly are. So prajna is this thing that sees through our assumption. It's the prajna that enables us to see through snake. So prajna is sometimes symbolized by this sword, Jushri holding a sword, right? So this quality is what cuts through our assumptions. It's intelligent because it opens up. It's lack of prajna that leads us to go into simple, mistaken beliefs about things. Like, if we judge, very often we know that when we're judging, we're actually stubbornly refusing to see the complexity of something. It's good. Oh, it's bad. Whatever. We don't want to know that it's a little bit good, a little bit bad, but it depends how you see it. We don't want to know that it's bad, it's good, whatever. Yeah, because it gives us a sense of sort of confirms our rigid sense of security. And it sort of takes us out of our insecurity. But when we're smart and we're not doing that, when we're kind of thinking about, what is it she was mentioning, which school to choose for our children and so forth, we try to cut through and see what's real here. And that's prajna. Prajna is our natural common sense wisdom. It's something that we already know. So we might have a Sanskrit name for it, but Tibetan, by the way, is shit up. And as translators, actually, I have to say we sometimes a little bit sort of go back and forth between how to translate this. It's wisdom, but then again, sometimes wisdom we reserve for something that's called jnana, which is a more basic ground of knowing or non-delusion. And then we would say, well, okay, then wisdom, we would call it transcendental wisdom, and the other one, primordial wisdom. And sometimes we say intelligence, which I actually think is a good word, as long as we don't understand intelligence as intellectualism. Anyway, she says, you already have an intimate relationship with prajna. In the broadest sense, prajna serves as the guiding force you use to bring your actions together with your intentions. So we navigate with prajna, basically. And she also says, prajna can hold you in the boundary of your greater intentions and prevent you from making a mess. Like, we might have good intentions, but then we sort of get frustrated, impatient, and so forth. And it's actually prajna that enables us to not get caught up in lack of prajna, the sort of the pressing habitual patterns of ignorance. And she says, it is what we rely on to explore the mechanics of falling in and out of grace. If you have your sights set on moving out of delusion and into a sane relationship with your world, bring prajna to the path of liberation. So us staying out of the stubborn, pig-headed refusal to look, that is prajna, and that enables us to begin to sense something greater, which is then this quality of grace, this quality of we're going to look at this sort of non-finding that brings with it a sense of liberation. Now, we've looked at how praticca samutpada refers to the fact that things lean, right? So they don't have an inherent existence. So this is basic to what we perceive and what we experience. But there's something that comes with that, and that is what we're going to investigate. She implies that, or she goes through a further need to investigate our assumptions about this nature. Now, when we say the nature of experience is praticca samutpada, and we understand there's sort of a connectedness and things are contingent, it also means something very important, which is that there's actually there's no essence, there's no reality. And that actually also stands in contrast to the reality that we attribute to phenomena. Yeah? So we label things in particular ways that ignore the compounded or the dependent nature of phenomena. Now, we want to understand that this investigation, it has a big, what we call, pervasion. It encompasses everything pretty much. We could ask, is there anything that's not dependent? And when we look at these things, then we're going to look at, so we want to understand the pervasion of this in terms of when we begin to understand what we're looking at now, it has ramifications for everything. Now, it's not like, what we're going to arrive at is everything is dependently arisen, everything has the nature of freedom from these propositions that hinder us and actually experience reality. So this is how do you say, it's total. It's something that it's not as if the Buddha just sees some things and there's some things that are still not empty. This insight into reality is pervasive, complete, or whatever. But we're going to employ a methodology. We're going to look now, and this is then where we are doing analytical meditation, where we're doing loosening practice. We're going to say, is there anything that exists as a singular unity? Is there anything that exists as something permanent? Is there anything independent and unconditional? Okay, this we apply to analysis in general. Actually, I just wanted to draw your attention to, do I have it here? No, I don't. Okay. Okay. You have the reading folder, and I've actually put up some things there. Let me just have a look at it. Just so you know, let me introduce you to your reading folder. This is part of your this is part of what you get in this package, your subscription to this program here. So we're going to look at online studies. We're going to look at the reading folder. Okay. So this here, the reading folder. I put in some things that are helpful for what you're going to be doing or relevant for this. The Sutra on Dependent Arising is a very short sutra that basically has these lines in it that all dharmas originate from causes. These causes were explained by the Tathagata. This is a sutra, very short. Then you have a more extensive sutra, the Rice Seedling, which again brings home the point about dependent arising on the basis of some discussions with Maitreya Buddha. Then you have interesting work from the Zen tradition on the faith mind. And I think that might be quite interesting to look at. It takes this into a more experiential and inspired work. This comes from the Chan tradition. Then there's Jamgun Mipam. This is a more scholarly, and for those who are, interested in doing more familiarize yourself more with how this is taught in the classical context. This is a translation by Mike Dickman, and it's on Jamgon Mipam's explaining the nature of Pratisha Samutpada. Then there is, I included Francisco Varela's The Science of Consciousness as if Experience Matters. And then I've also included a little translation I did of a short article by Mipam Rinpoche, and it's establishing the twofold selflessness. And there, Jamgon Mipam, he uses this particular methodology that we talk about here, where we identify how we mistakenly attribute singularity, permanence, and independence to phenomena. That's what we're going to be investigating here. So just to let you know, you have this resource. So, of course, when we do this, we need to do this according to our own sentiment. And I don't know if you noticed, but if you have the Kindle edition, then there is actually a link to there's a link to Elizabeth actually leading you through the these meditations. So it's on shambhala.org. I'll put it up. I'll put it up as a link in the folder, so you can just click on that and go in there. I think that's probably the easiest. Let's see, it's shambhala.org. Here we have it. Okay, Shambhala, sorry, not shambhala.org, shambhala.com and / logic of faith meditations. Logic of faith meditations. So you have it there, shambhala.com / logic of faith meditations. But in there, it's actually very user-friendly because you actually have her reading through these meditations, which is very nice. And this is about us owning this in terms of something that we apply, not as a ritual, but it's about us actually using this as a personal tool. You buy the shovel and then you apply it in your own garden in your own way. You take ownership of it. Elizabeth says, to look at the interdependent nature of things in a precise way doesn't mean you have to get hyper-vigilant, self-focused, and neurotic. If you adopt a humble and childlike curiosity, the nature of interdependence will surprise, charm, and delight you. In fact, you may even fall in love with your mind and its world. You'll find it's much more open, it's much less tense in our sort of engagement. Now, the philosophical project is actually objective truth. Can we bring home a objective assessment about our reality? And so we have this universal project. Philosophers, scientists, seekers, they're looking for this objective truth. Now, many people have done that. Can you find somebody who has the right theory? Who has actually found it? She says, throughout history, no one has ever found an intrinsic truth. And why is this? It's because everything leans. Given that this is the case, chances are you won't find a definitive truth either. Yet such a thing is worth looking for, because as you search for a real thing, chances are you will encounter not finding, and not finding will be your source of liberating insight. Now, in modern philosophy, we do talk about the notion of relativization, and we have some understanding that things don't exist as in terms of the labels that we give them, and such truth is understood as something that is relativized, which is a big problem when we were searching for objective truth. And this has led some, like the like the American philosopher Richard Rorty, who would proclaim the end of there is no actual philosophical project because it is relativized. And we had Derrida, who, dismantling any notion of truth and logos with his deconstruction, also would say any truth is relative on, it's what it's not. It stands in relation. Again, that's great. But the thing is, unless that becomes something that you then experience free of just the mere cerebral or mathematical equation, then you don't actually come to a place where this could be the intention to free us from certain constraints. But where we go a bit further in the Buddhist project is something that lies beyond then the mere intellectual assessments of lacking truth or lacking truth with a capital T. And that's where we open up to this dimension that Elizabeth is talking about, this condition of grace and something that's experiential, a greater openness. And that's what's implicit then in what we're going to see, shunyata. Anyway, the first analysis, she says, don't make it a thing, is then that's the first meditation. Why analyze singularity? Because we attribute singularity to what in fact is not singular. We're making a mistake. First of all, we label things as units or plural. So we have, for example, the label the sun. But we know the sun is actually made up of gases and all sorts of conditions. When we talk about a problem, that's very relative. It's we might have a problem coming up with the rent. From our landlord's perspective, that's not a problem. So again, that in itself as an absolute doesn't exist. A herd of deer, well, obviously made up of units, a swarm of bees, and so forth. Elizabeth says to lump together and name things is not necessarily a problem. In fact, labels are useful. There is a herd of deer. There is a problem. We need to do something, right? Etc. But so language serves beautifully in order to have this cohesive way of dealing with our relative reality. But the point here, she goes on to say, is to understand that the nature of things will always remain free of the constraints of the labels you assign them. And now, interesting, this nature of things, that's how things actually are. And that's where we want to penetrate through, so we're not stuck on just some mistaken assumptions, where we'll be fooled, because assuming that there's singularity, we're going to be fooled about the nature of things, assuming permanence and so forth. She says, whether a thing is large or small, material or conscious, makes no difference. It is the notion of thingness which stems from seeing things as a whole, complete or inviolably singular, that we're questioning here. And I remember once sitting with a friend of mine who was maybe 9 years old at the time, and she asked me about somebody in a movie. Is that the good guy? Is that guy good or bad? And then I said, well, it depends, because it was a little bit sort of adult material in the sense that it wasn't that simple. It wasn't all about good and bad. It was sort of an unfortunate character that appeared bad, but wasn't necessarily bad as such. Good people do bad things, bad people do good things. So I said to her, well, it depends, because the movie would eventually lead to basically redeeming this poor chap. But when I said, well, it depends, she was a bit despairing, and she says, oh, I knew you were going to say that. Like, oh, I hate this relativity. Couldn't it just be simple and just say, this is a good person, this is a bad person, And that's happened when we mature. We're actually we develop prajna, and with age we begin to see complexity, if you like. The things are not inviolably singular. So in the meditation here, why is this so important? Because this enables us to see the nature of any given phenomena. Why did all the masters who wish to free beings from the pain of their delusion insist on this exercise? Well, because this is where we trip up, we mistake. And as a consequence, we get caught up in likes and dislikes and all the narrowness that feeds the pain of the delusion of ego. Take an object that you feel is very real for you, the body and emotion, etc. The more you investigate, the more you discover complexity and the more you loosen your initial concept. So that's where Ludwig Wittgenstein then said, only describe, don't explain, right? We can see this is what I'm feeling, this is what it is. Don't try to pigeonhole it into some explanation. Then look at the edges. Where do some things end and other begins, right? We can look at our joints. Where does the arm, the upper arm, and where does the elbow, and where does the elbow end? Where does the lower arm, and so forth, and so forth. So we can understand how there is no exact place. So at the end, we should ponder what we have found, which is actually that we, at the end, are at a loss for having clear labels, except we've been freed from some assumptions. We begin to understand that, things are complex. That enables us better to understand the functioning of our reality. So that was first, we looked at singularity, where we cannot actually, remember this, we cannot find anything singular in our reality. I think it was last time where we looked at this, where we looked at particles, right? And where we end up with, what was it you were saying? The particle zoo? We keep looking for smaller and smaller subatomic particles. And the more we look, then it keeps breaking down into finer and finer building blocks of reality. So we never ever actually find this unitary, ultimate existing part. So singularity, not possible because it doesn't exist, and as a result also not having a singularity, we don't also have plurality, because plurality would imply that there were many of one, but we haven't found one. This is not intended to be sophistry or mind games, but it's just to liberate us from some assumptions that are baseless. Now, we're going to apply this then to the notion of self, and that's where, again, quoting Wittgenstein, who Wittgenstein's contribution lies in language and understanding some of these structuralists. Was one of the key persons in terms of the structuralists' analysis of how we use language, and is famous for his analysis of language games and so forth. So Wittgenstein is significant in Western philosophy, and he says. One of the most misleading representational techniques in our language is the use of the word I, right? And it's not that difficult for us to see how complex this notion of I actually is, because we're ever changing. And hence we also, I actually threw in this reference to Heraclitus, who famously spoke about how everything is in flux, something that Plato also sort of elaborated upon. But he famously said that I can never step in the same river twice. And I went in and actually found the sort of what am I doing here? No. The translation of exactly what he said. Translation of it. And supposedly it says, upon those who step into the same rivers, different and ever different waters flow down. So we might have the Charles River, the Wilson River, whatever. Sure, the same river, but the water, constantly different, right? So that's where we attribute the notion of I, Jakob, to something that in fact is continually changing. So Elizabeth says, despite our recognition of change, we still hold tightly to permanence in some deep and subtle ways. The notion of I, right? I changed, but it's still me. You most likely assume, for instance, that there is a continuous self that does all this changing. So here then, the analytical meditation is about, well, the thing is, and this is so true, actually, she points out how we actually initially might feel perplexed about this, and that we might say, well, I'm not quite sure. Well, not so much from the point of view of the difficulty of it, more that we sort of not, what is this self actually, and what is this? And it just seems strange. But anyway, we should make that as all meditation. Whenever we have meditation resistance, we should just say, well, that's the first step. And just say, okay, that's good. There is something, there's a tension there that reflects something worth investigating. She says the wisdom that's sort of pushing from behind. Now we look, is there a permanent self in the body? As a discrete part of the body, is there some self then in terms of, is this me, and are they both me? Well, it seems to be, in that case, are there several? Or maybe the whole body, and so forth. So that means if I lose an arm, then there's less of me, etc. Investigate until the deeply rooted assumptions exist. And we're kind of going to come up with unfindability. We better get used to that. That's all right. We're not supposed to sort of like, okay, this is it. It's more about, my habits and my assumptions. They're groundless. Look at the one who nevertheless is attached to the sense of self, right? We go right back at the looker. Can you find anything real at all? If so, where is it? Where can you find that self? Is there such a thing as a neutral observer, someone that's completely disassociated? Well, we're continually changing, right? So if we are all these different changes that we go through, how can it be referred to as an unchanging self? Another thing is also time, where we could look in terms of what we call time. Yeah, we definitely need time. We have to be on time. We need to meet at 10 o'clock and so forth. So we need it. It's a very practical way of navigating our reality. But the thing is, does time really exist? Because right now there's a sense of a time that is existent, but honestly, the past moment is a non-existent. So how could a non-existent produce an existent? The past is gone, the future hasn't come, and it doesn't seem to that we ever move beyond this apparent present. But then again, is there something that we can pinpoint as present? Because we're going through changes, right? Probe deeply with this investigation. See if you can find a discrete moment. Of course, we know that we won't, but the exercise itself will help to, in a visceral way, experiential way, to undermine these assumptions. Yes, we have experience, and we do experience the present moment, but we say it's a bit like if we draw on water. And as things are drawn, then the arising and dissolution happens at the same time. Doesn't mean that we did do a drawing, we did a circle, we did a line, they weren't there, but it is on. There's nothing tangible about it. The moment that it's drawn, it's gone. So similarly, also like with the joints and so forth, can we say when exact moment when day changes to night, night to day, child to adult, life to death? Actually, if anybody listened to The Doors, there's a song called Break On Through to the Other Side. There's day to night, night to day. Anyway, yes, this is ways of breaking on through to the other side. Mind you, I'm not sure exactly if Jim Morrison and The Doors arrived at this sort of great, you could say, liberation of grace. Anyway, this is something that universally we as humans encounter. So everybody sees this, but we're taking this then as a way to engage with this greater vision of the middle way. So we cannot find any substantial moment of things where they arise, where they abide, or where they dissolve. And yet, of course, we speak of these things. I'm building a house. This is my house. This is the ruins of my house. So they're all there. But when we analyze all these moments, they're unfindable. Things in themselves are unfindable. And yet, yes, we did have a house. We built it. It fell down and so forth. So this is a shift from seeing impermanence to seeing unfindability. So this is important because we can understand impermanence on a gross level, but what we're seeing here goes further than that. It is to actually see that there's never been any essence. If once we had a seed that became a sprout, that became a plant, we cannot ever say that there was one moment where it existed in one particular way. In being in flux, there is no essence. There's this unfindability. And this also means that we go beyond just the sort of the sadness of the human or sentient condition of things are ever in change to actually beginning to see there's nothing actually there. There wasn't even something there. We didn't lose something because there was nothing to lose to begin with. And that might seem odd and groundless, but it actually introduces then these aspects of awe, magic, and fearlessness. Elizabeth says, this is the liberation that characterizes the specific insight of the middle way. The middle way investigation is not about denial of experience, but about the limitations that come with affirmation and denial, existence and non-existence, all these labels. So we're not about denying any of the appearances, but we're denying this pigeonholing of our experiences. And what we're doing here in removing the pigeonholing, also this is where Elizabeth, she notes that she's not asserting that there is a no self. She's just asking us to look for one. So she's not giving us the answer. Now you're a card-carrying Buddhist. You subscribe to the view of no self, as Buddhists do. That's not the point. We're asked to look. Just like we're not, we have this the rope that's mistaken as a snake, and somebody says there's no snake, there's just a rope, and then we go say, okay, there's no snake, there's just rope. But it's only when we actually look and see for ourselves that it has the impact that we're looking for. So we are not subscribing to a set of dogmas. We are investigating. So then there's the investigation of autonomy, the last one. If something exists as just that, as it had always existed independently, and that's then from scratch. Can we find scratch? Carl Sagan says, if you wish to make an apple pie from scratch, you must first invent the universe, right? Where did the apple come from? It came from the apple tree. Where did the apple tree come from? It came from the seed. Where did the seed come from? It came from the previous apple tree, etc. An apple pie requires many causes and conditions, as we know. So did our own creation. So if we look at the genealogy of this apple pie story, yes, we can see how much goes into it. Same with our parents, etc. Right? They're meeting, conceiving, and we can ponder the infinitude of conditions for any creation. Yeah, anything is like that. We will see through the mistaken notion of an autonomous self. So also there, where do I come from, etc., etc., etc. So she says, referring to Pratisha Samuppada, is what I experience, what I'm not confused about the larger scheme of things. So this is an understanding that begins to enable us to be unconfused. It eases things out. So she speaks about how this connects with the experience of grace. And in fact, Einstein himself talks about a separate self as a delusional assumption. Elizabeth, since the investigations of the middle way tradition make it clear that autonomy will never be an option, meaning that phenomena in and of themselves, of course, yes, we could say autonomy in a sense of freedom, sure, but here we're talking about something else. Autonomy in an object, that it's unconditional, as if this watch was unconditionally existent. It's made up of many parts. It's not autonomous. So she says, so don't waste your time trying to single yourself out of the bigger picture. You're not big, nor are you small. You're not important, nor are you insignificant. And you cannot be affirmed or denied. You're not the same as anything else, but neither are you separate. You're beyond the limitations of ordinary thinking, and you cannot be captured in thought. So as any phenomenon, ourselves are free from this kind of unconditionality. We're constructed. We're made up of causes and conditions. Now, what all of this leads to is an insight that we call shunyata, or emptiness. Ziga Kongtrul Rinpoche, It's Up to You, an important book he wrote, gosh, it's already probably 15 years, 20 years ago. He says, because the nature of everything is emptiness, it is possible to view our life the way we would view a movie. You can relax and enjoy the show. And, this is very sweet because she then Elizabeth describes how she actually, sort of like sometimes it can be rather irritating to have these sort of like, oh, it's just, it's all just magic. Yeah. But at the same time, yes, analysis does show things lean, and yet we still have a strong sense of, hey, wait a minute. Yes, this is how it is, and yet I experience it differently. And so she says, as I begin to practice, meaning these analysis, I struggle to reconcile these new ideas with some beliefs I had about how things are. My thinking and my experience had yet to come together. And she says, in those rare and precious moments of grace, actually, then she speaks about how it clicked at one point. And this was not about all of a sudden having sort of some satori in being completely liberated, but it's just an opening up that of course doesn't mean that she's forever in the condition of Dharmakaya or insight or prajna, but more that there's an underlying confidence in the nature of things. So she says, in those rare and precious moments of grace, where you can enjoy the open dimensionality of things, you will feel emancipated from your fears and insecurities. You will find that your ability to not be right, to see the illusory nature of things, releases an unshakable confidence, clear seeing, and joy in you. So this greater vision is then about something that is less about knowing and more about awe. The unfindable nature of things is not nihilistic in its scope. It is about opening to life and experience. The unfindability and openness of Praticca Samuppada is liberating insight. So we're doing something that has to do with opening up and not reducing our reality. Dzogchen Pinlop says, if you want things to be real, don't analyze them. And that's where we would say, if we're going to be penetrating illusion, all we need to do is begin to question, as per Ayadeva's quote in the beginning. The moment we begin to question things, they come apart in the sense that they seem to be complex. So if you want to stick with the simple version of things, okay, just don't think, don't analyze. Yeah. And in fact, that's what we do in ordinary life. We need to operate. Practically speaking, we operate fine. We do say, I'll be there at 10. We don't say, oh, 10 o'clock. That's doesn't exist ultimately. No, 10 o'clock's it's there. So we would say what we call, when we analyze reality, we arrive at some insight that we call absolute truth. But when we don't, we operate within relative truth. Now, as you probably guessed, and this was a big chapter, we're going to go over time. I hope you're up for that. There's a quote from the Buddha in the Majjhima Nikaya, in the Pali Canon, where and this also we have in the first lines of the Mula Madhyamika Karika, from Nagarjuna. But the Buddha says, "This being, that becomes. From the arising of this, that arises. This not being, that becomes not. From the ceasing of this, that ceases." So again, this leads to that. When there is no this, then there's no that. When this ceases, that ceases. Again, leaning. What we call emptiness or shunyata is the actual nature of anything that leans. Yeah, this could be two, it could be one. It looks like a roof, and this exists on the basis of conditioning. So there's a lack of inherent existence from its own side. This does not obstruct the manifest aspect. It doesn't mean that there are no things, but it does show us that things undeniably arise in dependency, pratitya samutpada. Now, that lack of inherent existence in things is what we could call open dimensionality. We might think that if we begin to say emptiness, then some people might think that it's like a nothing. We arrive at a place where there's nothing. Now, Elizabeth said, the mind that knows emptiness does not mistake the map for the territory or cling to rightness or truth. It clearly sees the interconnected relationship of things without losing the bigger picture by fixating on realness. So this enables us to see things in a greater way. It doesn't become a new dogma in itself. We still operate with the functionality or relative nature of things. Elizabeth says, wisdom here describes the experience of finding your place in the infinite nature of contingency. A deep sanity arises from this. This experience of sanity is what I mean when I say grace. So this quality of openness that is completely common sense, completely intelligent, sensitive, and so forth, this is connecting to a deeper quality of sanity that has this beauty and this grace. When we have those who realize pratitya samutpada, try and notice their graciousness, their elegance, and also their ease in the world. The two truths, and these we have touched at now implicitly in terms of analyzing or not analyzing. And that means that phenomena, they don't fall into these, intrinsically doesn't fall into any kind of category whatsoever. It defies definition and so forth. And that's the nature of everything. So there's this emptiness nature, and yet within that everything manifests. Longchenpa in the basic space of phenomena says, it has never existed as anything whatsoever, yet arises as anything at all. And this refers to this nature that we're talking about, shunyata and so forth. It's not something that can be grasped. It can never become an object of philosophy. As Shantideva also says, the absolute is never the scope of the intellect. Now, of course, if we come across this, we might think the insight of pratitya samutpada is otherworldly. You know, like people hear about emptiness, and they might you hear these lines, you know, very sweetly. Emptiness is all well and good, but what about climate change? Don't tell me that doesn't exist. And she's also, you know, don't tell me that, you know, that all these, this is all very good, but what about the real world with the real problems? Yeah. So if we're beginning to think of emptiness as some sort of rarefied Buddhist project that we're engaging in that has nothing to do with the rest of reality, then it's not really going to provide, it's not really going to function as the medicine for the predicament we're trying to address, which is our reality and our misapprehension of reality. So that's where we talk about this division preventing us from actually integrating this insight. So if we begin to take this as different from something else, solidify this idea, then we're going to fail to work with the issue at hand, our reality. Now, in here, then, there's two great minds in the Mahayana tradition that we're referring to. There's Jamgon Rinpoche, who draws on Nagarjuna. Nagarjuna, particularly, is known as the father of the Mahayana tradition. What we want to, and Nagarjuna specifically identified and operated with this notion of the two truths. The open dimensionality of Praticca Samutpada, Shunyata, it offers, basically there's two ways to approach it. One is that we experience a relative truth, which we do, my hand, right? The conventional perception of things, absolute truth, the actual nature of things. Well, I label this my hand, but it's made up of many different things, and in that it's made up, it lacks singularity, it lacks permanence, it lacks autonomy, it's a dependent arising, and hence it lacks essence. And that is then what we call absolute truth of things. Now, this is an important one here. So this quote in its completeness: emptiness does not negate appearance. Things are simply empty because they're mutually dependent. To assume that things intrinsically possess objective characteristics is to misunderstand their very nature. To misperceive the nature of appearances is the basis for deception, delusion, and reactivity. If, on the other hand, you remember the open dimensionality of experience, the absolute truth of emptiness, it will inform your actions, and you will be able to respond to life based on seeing clearly. So last time, remember, we had the short and the long sticks, very relative, also the 6 that is seen as either 6 or a 9, and so forth. So that object that's on the ground being perceived as a 6 or as a 9, in itself, it doesn't have any allegiance either to 6 or 9ness. Likewise, the stick doesn't have any allegiance to be long or short. But if we begin to say that is long, that is short, and then we have the reactivity, then we are going to be responding to life in a very confused way. Simply, it is because everything leans that all things are empty of defining characteristics. So simply that nature of shunyata, it's because that they're just things in themselves, don't have any intrinsic value. They're neither long nor short, 6 or 9. But we could also say it is because of emptiness that phenomena can arise. Now, if that 6 or 9 didn't have emptiness, it would be a 6. And then it would be a 6 for everybody. If it wasn't that the stick is empty of long and short, then it wouldn't be able to be perceived as long or short. It would always be seen as long or short. And this is where we understand we have perceptions of things, but they don't have intrinsic existence. But at the same time also, this nature is not limited in terms of just being nothing. Yes, that very nature gives rise to everything, as Longchen is saying. So form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Form is no other than emptiness, emptiness is no other than form. This is from the Heart Sutra, famously. Elizabeth said it would be most useful to see Nagarjuna's teachings on the two truths as a means or tool, rather than a truth that helps us use prajna, or accurate discernment, to penetrate misunderstandings we have about the way things are. So it's very helpful to have this. This tool is rather indispensable, but it does not mean that it amounts to a dogmatic absolute that then we should get all rigid about. Yes, it's valid, but we wouldn't want to use it as some sort of fundamentalist absolute. That would destroy the whole purpose. And that's why we sometimes talk about, with that kind of fundamentalism or narrowness, where we're not using prajna, but rather we're just holding on to a dogma, then we say the medicine, that what could have become the medicine instead becomes the poison. So use it with discerning. And for next time, please read chapter 3, Faith. No questions? Very welcome to ask questions. No questions, no questions. See. In a practical sense, understanding the nature of things as empty. Yeah. How can it affect the way we relate in everyday life? Would that be like remaining calm rather than engaging in an argument with someone who has done wrong by us, for example? Is that compassion? Well, yes. The understanding of emptiness, pratitya samutpada, understanding that we see things differently, that avoids us to, for example, having the argument. Let's say we, for example, might have an argument about a piece of music, right? So if we're compassionate, if we understand that the other person, we talk with our, let's say, grandfather, who's a great fan of, let's say, Brahms or Beethoven, and we say, yeah, it's all very nice, but I prefer, I don't know, something else. Emptiness is understanding that the grandfather and us, our sort of perceptions of, let's say, Beethoven's Fifth, they're different. Or our understanding of, something, Barbara, what's it called? Barbara Streisand or whatever, pieces of music, they're relative. And so it comes with a gentleness. It's understanding, yes, we remain calm. We don't say Beethoven's Fifth is dreadful, or, this song by Barbara Streisand is dreadful or good or whatever. It has that softness. So the inside of pratitya samutpada remains open, saying, I'm glad that you like that piece. So this insight into emptiness, the way that we're integrating this is about being accommodating. And it has, again, this quality of not being a dogma, but more being something that enables us to see how things exist relatively, that they don't exist from their own side as good or bad, but it's really about how we perceive the objects. Does that make sense? Anyway, this is a big chapter, and it's worth reading again and again. This, what Elizabeth actually in a brilliant way has made sort of very accessible, is something that in the classical literature sometimes comes across as a little bit tough chewing. So so it's definitely a big topic. It's important. So this chapter here is worth revisiting and thinking about. And like I said, on the shambhala.com, Logic of Faith Meditations, and shambhala.com/Logic of Faith Meditations. In there you then have her going through the analytical meditations. So there's a lot of homework in this, and it goes beyond just this 6-week study. This is something that's a key, really. It's very beautiful, and it gives way to such a big space of enlightenment, space of temporary happiness. So this is an important one. Okay. So please read the next chapter next time. By this positive action, may all beings perfect the accumulation of merit and wisdom and attain the two supreme kayas which arise from merit and wisdom. Thank you.